You ever walk into a room and feel like you're watching life happen instead of living it? Everyone else seems to belong to the rhythm of conversation, the energy of the group, the easy confidence that you've never quite been able to fake. You smile, maybe even laugh at the right time. But deep down, there's a silence you can't explain. A quiet sense that no matter what you say, you're always half a second out of sync. Not just with them, but with reality itself. This isn't just awkwardness. It's not just social anxiety or being introverted. It's something older, deeper, a sense that you're fundamentally not part of the world in the same way others are. You're in it, but not of it. And the worst part is, no one sees it. You look normal. You function. You succeed, maybe. But something in you is always scanning for a doorway out of this reality, or into one that finally fits. If that feeling has followed you for years, you need to hear what Jung discovered, because you're not broken, and you're not alone. There's a reason for this quiet exile, and it holds a deeper meaning than most people will ever understand. Stay with this till the end, because what you'll hear may not only explain why you've always felt like an outsider, it might finally give you a place to stand. There's a hidden journey behind this pain, and Carl Jung knew the cost of walking it. He also knew its power, because some people aren't meant to belong in the world as it is. Some are meant to see through it and shape something new. There's a special kind of pain that comes from being surrounded by people, yet still feeling unseen. You might be in the middle of a conversation, nodding, responding, even smiling. But inside you feel like you're speaking from behind a glass wall. You can't quite relax. You can't quite connect. Not fully. Something's always slightly off. And after enough of those moments, a quiet belief begins to form. Maybe it's me. That belief becomes a background noise in your life. Not loud enough to scream, but always there. It colors everything. How you approach others, how you interpret silence, how you hold yourself in a crowd. You perform just enough to avoid suspicion, but it never feels quite real. And deep down, you start to wonder, is there something wrong with me that I can't fix? This is where the emotional grip of being an outsider tightens. It doesn't just isolate you. It makes you turn against yourself. You start dissecting your own thoughts, overanalyzing every social interaction, trying to decode what others seem to know instinctively. You want belonging, but it never seems to happen naturally. It always feels earned, forced, costly. So you drift between two conflicting states, needing connection and fearing it, longing to be seen and terrified that if someone really saw you, they'd walk away. And worst of all, no one around you notices this war you're fighting. From the outside, you might seem calm, stable, even successful. But inside, you're carrying a private ache that never fully disappears. You may not even have the words for it, only the feeling that something about you is fundamentally off. But here's the truth Jung began to uncover, and what most people never realize. This feeling isn't always a sign of psychological failure. Sometimes, it's the mark of someone who's more in tune, not less. Someone whose awareness makes them sensitive to things others can easily ignore. Someone whose soul never quite accepted the roles they were handed. Being different doesn't mean you're defective. But when the world doesn't reflect that truth back to you, it becomes easy to forget. Carl Jung believed that the psyche doesn't just suffer, it signals. When you feel like you don't belong, like the world isn't built for you, that's not always a symptom to eliminate. Sometimes it's a message from the unconscious, a sign that you're out of sync with what the world expects, but in alignment with something much older inside you. Jung didn't name an outsider archetype, but the emotional reality of the outsider, the feeling of quiet separation, of not fitting in, lives across several of his most powerful archetypes, and understanding them changes everything. The first is the orphan, the part of us that feels abandoned, betrayed, or emotionally exiled. This archetype forms early in life, especially if you grew up feeling unseen, criticized, or emotionally unsafe. The orphan learns to expect rejection and eventually assumes that love must be earned through performance or perfection. Then there's the seeker, the part of the psyche that refuses to settle for surface-level answers. This archetype drives people to leave the group, challenge cultural illusions, and search for truth, even if it means walking alone. The seeker wants belonging, but not at the cost of integrity. Another is the rebel, the part that challenges authority, breaks patterns, and disrupts illusions. The rebel often becomes an outsider because it refuses to lie, to fit in, or to play along. But beneath its defiance is often pain, the pain of being punished for seeing what others deny. And finally, the outsider often becomes entangled with the shadow, the hidden parts of ourselves we've repressed or society has rejected. The more we suppress those traits, the more alien we feel, even to ourselves. But when we begin to face the shadow, something shifts. What once made us strange starts to look like a strength. When these archetypes converge in someone who's deeply self-aware, deeply reflective, the result is often alienation. Not because that person is broken, but because they're too awake to fully merge with the illusions that others live by. The pain of being an outsider is real, but it's not random. It's part of a psychological pattern, a symbolic separation that often precedes transformation. And Jung knew, if you understand that, you're no longer lost. You're on a path. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But becoming who you are isn't a straight path. It almost always begins with a rupture, a moment when the world you were handed no longer makes sense. For many, that rupture comes in the form of alienation. To feel like an outsider is, in one sense, to be exiled from the collective. But in Jung's deeper view, that exile often marks the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming a whole, conscious self, distinct from the masks and illusions of society. And that process can be brutal. Because the moment you stop unconsciously merging with the group, with its norms, its values, its unspoken rules, you start to see things. You notice contradictions, falsehoods. You sense a deeper truth beneath appearances. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. In mythology, this moment is often represented by the hero's departure from the village, or the exile of the prophet into the wilderness. The hero doesn't belong anymore because their consciousness has shifted. They're no longer just living. They're witnessing. They're questioning. And that makes them dangerous. This is why Jung emphasized the role of the outsider not as a failure, but as a necessary function of consciousness itself. A society that cannot tolerate outsiders is a society that rejects its own shadow. It forces conformity at the expense of growth. But the true outsider doesn't reject the group out of ego or bitterness. They separate because something in them refuses to betray what's real. They walk alone because they know that belonging isn't worth losing yourself. And this is what makes the outsider not just a wounded figure, but a transformational one. Like the mythic wanderer or the solitary sage, the outsider sees what the group cannot. They carry clarity into places that have been clouded by delusion. And that clarity is their gift, but also their burden. Jung's forgotten truth is this: to feel like an outsider is not a sign that you've failed to adapt. It may be the first sign that you've begun to wake up. The moment you realize your outsiderness isn't a flaw, something shifts. It's subtle at first. You stop blaming yourself for not blending in, for missing some invisible rule. You begin to see that the disconnection you felt isn't proof that you're broken. It's proof that your mind stayed awake in a world that rewards sleep. The outsider sees the world through different eyes, and that has always been a dangerous thing. But once you understand it, once you name it, that same pain becomes a source of power. You stop chasing belonging in places that require you to abandon your depth. You stop apologizing for your clarity. You were never meant to disappear into the crowd. You were meant to observe, to question, to pierce through the performance. And yes, that makes connection harder at times. It means fewer people will get you. It means you may always feel a little bit apart. But that's because you're aligned with something older than popularity, something quieter than applause. You are not meant for surface-level approval. You're meant for depth. And people who are built for depth often wander alone for a while. Not because they're unlovable, but because they refuse to settle for counterfeit connection. Jung understood that the journey of individuation isn't about self-improvement in the traditional sense. It's about self-acceptance at a level so deep it dissolves the false roles we've been taught to play. The outsider doesn't need to become like everyone else. They need to become fully themselves and learn to stand there without flinching. That's when something changes. You begin to attract people who aren't drawn to your mask, but to your essence. You begin to build a sense of belonging that comes not from fitting in, but from finally being fully seen. There is no greater relief than no longer needing to be someone you're not. And that relief begins when you stop asking how to belong and start asking who you are when you stand alone. Maybe the reason you've always felt like an outsider is because you are. Not in the way the world would define it, not as someone lesser or broken or incomplete, but as someone who came into this world with a kind of vision most people spend their lives avoiding. Most people don't want to see what's underneath. They want comfort, simplicity, the safety of the familiar, and those things are fine until you begin to feel the cost of that comfort. Until you start noticing what everyone else seems to ignore. Until the roles you're expected to play begin to suffocate you. That's when the split happens. That's when the world begins to feel distant. Not because it left you behind, but because you saw through it. And once you've seen through something, you can't go back. Jung knew this well. He knew the journey of individuation isn't about escaping life. It's about going so deeply into yourself that you re-emerge as something the world can't quite place. Not easily defined, not easily accepted, but entirely real. Being an outsider isn't a punishment, it's a path. And the longer you walk it, the more you realize it's not about finding a place to fit in. It's about finding the clarity to stand apart without apology. Because in the end, the world was never meant to contain your clarity. It was meant to be changed by it. If this resonated with you, like, share, and subscribe to The Existential Edge for more videos like this.